Hey everyone, welcome back. It's my long-awaited Phase 3 BIS gearing guide for mages for upcoming TOGC, which is coming up here quick. And before we dive right in, I want to give a general overview of what I'm going to go over. First, all of the BIS sets are listed in the video description for you to open up and look at while following along. Because first I'm going to cover information that is spec agnostic, such as DPS differences between the specs, how the tier works, and best gearing path for the tier tokens. The changes in how we gem due to socket bonuses, differences between my BIS sets and the Fusion Loot Prio Sheet and Wowhead, etc., crafting gear and emblem gear, and more. And after that info, I'll cover each spec separately. And different from my previous videos, I plan to just cover each gearing set at a general level with only the most pertinent information covered, thus hopefully keeping this video well under 1.5 hours, unlike my previous videos. Let's all pray together that that is indeed the case. All right, let's dive right in. First, I just want to note, if you didn't know, the Horde and the Alliance have different names for their items, so I'm going to try and just refer to things as hit weapon or non-hit weapon, or the, say, non-hit neck, or the hit chest for off-piece, or non-hit chest for off-piece, or things like that in that way, because they have different names. So some of the names are very similar between Alliance and Horde, such as Cord of Biting Cold for Alliance is Belt of Biting Cold for Horde, so it's Biting Cold for both. Same with like the boots are Mourning Widow for both. It's Sandals of Mourning Widow versus Boots of the Mourning Widow, but some of them are completely different names, like the weapons or the cloak and the ring are completely different names. So Bland of Deplorable for Alliance and Lurid Manifestation for Horde, for the ring, for example. And the same with the weapons, completely different. Mortalis for Horde. For Alliance, it's Blade of the Unbroken Covenant. So I'm going to try and just generically refer to things, and just know that if you're looking at the different BIS lists, that the actual stat values are completely the same. The names could be just a little different though. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next, I just want to touch on the DPS differences between the specs in Phase 3 BIS, and I'm using Safari's sheet to show this, and you can see that in the video description. And shout outs to Safari once again for this great information. Really appreciate it. He has it for different kill times, and also has his sim configs linked here. And MS just equals Tide plus Vate, so 1 Mana Tide and 1 Innervate, just in case you didn't know what the MS means. And he also has Frostfire with Focus Magic listed here. And as you can see, Fire and Arcane are now much closer in value, unlike with Phase 2 BIS. So if any kind of the fight has any kind of multi-dot, cleave, or anything like that, it'll completely close the gap, and Fire will be ahead of Arcane. And only on single target tank and spank with an Arcane mage that really knows what they're doing are they going to possibly be able to out DPS a Fire mage. But otherwise, Fire just being easier to play more often than not, it's going to have it's going to perform better than Arcane, especially on so many of these fights are always have multi-dot or cleave in some capacity, and that is going to put Fire ahead. And the main reason for this is just that Phase 3 BIS, the tier 9 set bonuses benefit Fire much more because it's all crit, and crit is not that great for Arcane. And so it's just as simple as that. And then Fire TTW being ahead of FFB by a significant margin here, 200 plus DPS, is just due to Fire TTW scaling better with better gear. So, you know, now we're at that point where Fire TTW is significantly ahead of FFB, and so I recommend to definitely be playing Fire TTW if you're going to be a Fire mage nowadays. You can find the hit gear to make Fire TTW work and outscale FFB, and by the end of Phase 3, Fire TTW will definitely be ahead. It was already ahead for other reasons in Phase 2, just due to rankings, for a number of reasons that I got into in my rankings video, but now it's definitely going to be significantly ahead no matter what, not just for rankings, but just on average it will be doing more damage. And we can also see this with the tier 9 3-minute BIS histogram here that Safari put together as well. We can just see that the Fire TTW distribution is to the right of the FFB, and it's just simply going to be doing more DPS on average. And I put that with my BIS list at about a 250 DPS advantage to Fire TTW, with FFB only being tied with Fire on average if FFB is getting a focus magic, and so then it's not giving a focus magic to someone else. So Fire TTW, even without another mage in the raid, is going to be doing the same damage as FFB without a focus magic. And then as far as a total raid DPS wise, you're, as a Fire TTW, you're giving a focus magic to someone and you're boosting their DPS. So Fire TTW is just overall, even if you're the only mage, is going to be more raid DPS, and your personal DPS is still going to be the same as if you were FFB. So just basically Fire TTW is highly what I recommend for this phase now, no longer FFB. If you want to be an FFB though, I still provide you a BIS list here, and I just still am going to talk about FFB if you just want to be FFB for whatever reason, but there just really isn't the need anymore. The main reason we were FFB in Ulduar was just for speed runs. Pretty much all of the top mages in the world were using FFB in speed runs, and that was the only reason we were really using FFB, is because it was just had better AoE and with due to Blizzard, and then also was more mana efficient. But that's really just not needed in TOGC at all, and so now Fire TTW is definitely the play and what I recommend, and I would only be Arcane if you really enjoy Arcane, or if you're really trying to min-max some parses on, say, Jaraxxus or Twin Valks, where Arcane can possibly out DPS Fire, or if you have to be Arcane for faction champions just due to the CC and survivability that it offers. Those are possibly the reasons I would be Arcane, or of course if you have to be providing the 3% damage buff for your raid because there isn't a Ret or BM Hunter in the raid. But other than that, Fire TTW I think is totally the play this phase. Next, I just want to cover how you get the tier tokens in case you didn't know. So there is a tier that you can just buy with straight emblems. It's going to be eye level 232. But then to get the eye level 245, you're actually going to need a trophy of the Crusade that drops within the raid. And then you combine that with a higher emblem cost in order to get the piece. And note that you do not need to be buying the eye level 232 in order to get the 245. It's completely separate. You don't need to buy the 232 and then upgrade or anything like that. And then finally, to get the 258 pieces, you have to get Regalia of the Grand Vanquisher, which drops from the final chest. And so here I'm now going to talk about the chest. So this is the chest from Heroic TOGC. Do Heroic TOGC, and depending on the amount of temps remaining, that will determine the amount of loot you get from the chest. So not the loot that's off of Nubarak, that's a separate loot table, the loot that comes from the chest. And in order to get the cloak, the really coveted cloak, you have to have 50 attempts remaining. In order to get an extra 2 pieces of tier token, you have to have at least 45 attempts remaining. You're always going to get at least 2 pieces of the Regalia. No matter what, you'll get 2 of the 258 tokens. But in order to get 4 tokens from the chest, you need to have at least 45 attempts remaining. And note that these are still divided up between the classes, so Conch, Prot, and Vanquisher, but it is just a Regalia of the Grand Vanquisher, and then in-game, you can use that Regalia of the Grand Vanquisher for any slot. So it's not divided up by legs or gloves or a helm token or anything like that. And then it also doesn't cost you any emblems either. So the 258 tokens are pretty nice if you're able to get those, but keep in mind now, you're only getting a max, even if you have 45 attempts remaining, you're full clearing from the first week and always having at least 45 attempts remaining, you're getting only a max of 4 258 tokens a week. And TOGC is likely going to be a shorter phase. They already said it was going to be a shorter phase. It's not going to be as long as Ulduar. It could still be 14 weeks of TOGC, or at least 12 because there's an arena season. We'll see. But even at 14 weeks, that's only 14 people, assuming you're full clearing with 45 attempts remaining, 14 people that will get all 4 258. And what's more likely is that it'll probably be spread out amongst your guild, right? So you're not going to get full 258 unless you're running splits, or you're just buying it all in a GDKP, or Corrupted Loot Council, or something like that. So just take note of that. That's something to keep in mind. But the trophies of the Grand Crusade, these you can get up to 10 a week from the 25-man and 4 from 10-man. So that's 14 a week between 25 and 10-man. And so it will not take that many weeks before everyone in your raid should have at least all or 4 pieces of 245 and even 5 pieces, certainly by the end of the phase. Even if you're not full clearing by the end of the phase, I expect all guilds to be able to have enough Trophy of the Crusades to completely gear out their raid with 245 eye level pieces. So on that note, you shouldn't really need to buy 232 pieces unless you really have the Emblems of Triumph that you want to spend, to maybe get a 2-piece, so you have 1 Trophy of the Crusade and you have enough emblems to then buy a 232 piece and a 245 piece to then be able to break your tier 8 set bonus, and then equip tier 9 set bonus by doing 1 245 piece and 1 232. That's the only reason I would use my emblems on the 232. I wouldn't waste them unless you're a number of weeks into the phase and you have extra emblems to spare, because it's just not needed, and you should be able to get enough Trophies of the Crusade pretty early into the phase to be buying the 245 pieces to do the upgrades. But it all depends. It just depends on how much you're going to farm up emblems. And note that for emblems, you can see pinned here in my chat, you can get 25 badges per week from doing 25-man, 20 badges per week from 10-man, and then there's Oni and VOA. So you can get 55 a week just from raiding, and then 35 a week from doing the daily Heroic Plus Plus by 5 per day for the daily Heroic, basically. So at 90 a week. So you can get quite a few. However, I mean, I personally don't want to be running the daily heroic plus every single day. I'm certainly going to do it the first few weeks or whatever, make sure I have enough emblems, just make sure I'm cushy just in case I do happen to get the trophies, since it's strong for mages. I'm not exactly sure the prio, but for your guild, for instance. But, you know, I'm going to do it at first, but I don't want to be running daily heroic plus certainly any more than I have to. So I would be leery on wasting them on 232 unless it really makes sense. That's basically what I'm getting at, but that's how many emblems you can get per week. And then on that note of tier pieces, I now want to cover the tier 9 bonuses versus the tier 8 bonuses. So I've gotten a number of questions as far as when you're going to break tier 8 4-piece. Tier 8 4-piece is so valuable, are we even going to break it until we have a number of high-level tier 9 pieces? The thing is, tier 8 4-piece, while it sounds really powerful, in practice, it's not overpowered in terms of DPS versus tier 9. Both the tier 9 bonuses are pretty good. Tier 9 2-piece starts out at around, you know, some like 2% something crit for all of your spells, and then tier 9 4-piece is of course 5% crit for your main nuke. Both those are actually pretty good. Tier 8 4-piece has a lot of value on fights with movement, where you actually get the proc and it allows you some extra movement. But if you don't get the proc during movement, then, you know, it's a 20% proc chance, and it's actually not a huge DPS increase versus the tier 9 set bonuses. It's just really fun. And so obviously it sucks that we're losing that really fun set bonus, but the tier 9 bonuses are still really good. And more crit means you're going to get more hot streak proc, so that's kind of nice with the tier 9 set bonuses. We always like to crit, right? So just to give a little demonstration of this as well, just going from tier 8 232 to tier 9 232, we can get a pretty big DPS increase. Now part of that is because of the helm for tier 9 is much better statted, and same with the shoulders, than the tier 8 pieces. So for instance, the tier 8 piece for the helm has spirit on it, while the tier 9 helm has hit and haste instead of the spirit. And so if we switch to that, and then we also swap to the 232 shoulders for tier 9, you can see that they have crit haste, which is great in terms of itemization versus the spirit and haste. So if we swap to those, which is also really nice that we can do that swap, because the shoulders are both DPS, the helms are both hit. We're a little under hit cap when we swap to the tier 9, so if we then also do a veil gem into our wand or just any yellow slot, and notice I'm not using epic gems here just because the phase 2 BIS list wasn't using epic gems, so just to have an apples to apples comparison, I'm just sticking with the non-epic gems. But once phase 3 hits, you'll switch to all epic gems. Then we hit another run. You can see we get an 86 DPS increase just going to that. Now part of that is because of the itemization, but the point being that DPS increase is mainly coming from the better itemization on the pieces, but the set bonus going from tier 8 4-piece to tier 9 2-piece plus tier 8 2-piece is just as valuable in terms of DPS for set bonuses, essentially. They're very close, and so you don't have to worry about losing one set bonus or another, as long as you're not breaking a set bonus and not getting another. So if you went from tier 8 4-piece to just tier 8 2-piece or just tier 9 2-piece and then some off pieces, yeah, then you're going to be losing some DPS. But if you go from tier 8 4-piece to tier 9 2-piece plus tier 8 2-piece, and then from that to tier 9 4-piece, you're not going to be losing really much DPS. And this is actually the gearing path that I recommend as well for upgrading your tier. From tier 8 to tier 9 is doing the helm and shoulders first, because the stats on them are just so well itemized, and then also they are a 1-to-1. The helm is going from hit to hit, and the shoulder is going from non-hit to non-hit, so it's just easy upgrade. From there, I recommend, if you have Pharaoh's gloves, then I would recommend using a trophy and getting the chest. Everyone's going to have enough, you know, there's going to be enough trophies to go around for everyone's going to be able to get 5 by the end of the phase. So using a trophy on the chest is going to be perfectly fine, I think. And you could do the chest and the legs then, and continue to use Pharaoh's as an off piece, because it's a very strong off piece. And so you could do the legs and the chest at the same time. One, because you want to obviously go from one set bonus to another set bonus, but also because the chest for tier 8 was not hit and the chest for tier 9 is hit, and vice versa for the legs as well for tier 8 versus tier 9. So that way you're not having to screw with any hit or hit loss. Now if you don't have the Pharaoh's as an off piece, then I would recommend getting the tier 9 gloves and the tier 9 legs, and then using the crafted chest, the 245 Merlin's robe, which is pretty well itemized. It's got crit and haste. The only thing is then you're going to need to find the hit somewhere else, as if you're fire TTW, depending on your other hit gear. So that could be challenging, but that is definitely a pretty good gearing path. It's going to cost you some gold from Crusader's orbs and whatnot if you're trying to get it early in the phase, but going to that 245 chest from a 232 chest, and also getting the tier 9 bonuses from your gloves and legs, it's going to be nice DPS increase. Going back to the Pharos gloves though, when you do that and you have, say you have Pharos gloves and you have your tier 9 4-piece then on the other slots, you're not going to want to upgrade to your tier 9 gloves, of course, until you have the 258 hit off-piece chest. And then you could then swap out the Pharos gloves to the 245 gloves, but it's not going to be as big of an increase as you would think, because the Pharos gloves are actually just as well itemized as the tier 9 gloves. So even though the tier 9 gloves, if we take a look at them, they're 258. If you compare them to the Pharos gloves, because the Pharos have that extra gem slot, let's just say you were going to compare them with using the 258 tier chest, which has the exact same amount of hit as the off-piece. And we're now going to do a comparison of the Pharos versus the tier 9 gloves. So basically tier 9 5-piece versus using the Pharos as an off-piece. The Pharos gloves are actually a lot more DPS, right? Because even though they're 6 item levels lower, they have that extra gem slot. They're just really well itemized. And so thus they're just more DPS. So that's just illustrating how good the Pharos gloves are. So you really, when you switch from Pharos gloves as your off-piece to using the 258 chest as your off-piece, and then the tier 9 gloves, you really would ideally want that 258 token to get those 258 tier 9 gloves. Next, I want to cover the Fusion Loot Prio sheet that Jordy and Pummel made. I've been getting a number of questions on this. I'm not involved in the Loot Prio sheet, so you know, that's why my BIS lists are different than their BIS lists. They got their BIS list from Philippe, from what I understand, which should correspond to the Wowhead BIS list. However, I believe the Wowhead Fire BIS list does differ from this one, and I'm just going to touch on that to explain that real quick. So one of the reasons is just the fact that there's differences in gearing paths. So for instance, with the Mage Arcane list that they have here, you can see that they go Blade of Taras, which is the hit weapon for Alliance, and then Rod of Imprisoned Souls. I had them add the Sprig as well, because you need to note that the Petrified Ivy Sprig is basically just as good as the Rod of Imprisoned Souls. So even if you're only using a little bit of the hit with the Petrified Ivy Sprig, it's just that good, where they're going to be the same DPS as the Rod of Imprisoned Souls. So even though the Rod of Imprisoned Souls looks really good, just in terms of its itemization, its crit haste, Petrified Ivy Sprig is just really good. It's got the gem slot, and that just really helps it out with that because of that gem slot. And so they go Blade of Taras, and if you take a look at mine, instead of that, I go the non-hit weapon and Petrified Ivy Sprig with then a couple Veiled Gems, a Veiled Gem in the Petrified Ivy Sprig and a Veiled Gem in the chest. Get the hit to make it perfect hit for Alliance. And that actually sims the same DPS as this one, and this list is from Wowhead that they got from Philippe, from what I understand. So the reason for that is just an alternate gearing path, which is good to hear, right? We can go different paths with gearing and get the same DPS, and in some cases, it's alternate paths and very close, like within 10-15 DPS, which is basically within the margin of error for the sim, so it's basically the same. And in this case, it's like really is actually the exact same. For the Fire TTW list they have here, the main difference between this list and the Wowhead list and my list, if we go to Fire TTW for Phase 3 Alliance, is that I go with Armbands of the Ashen Saint and then a Veiled Gem in the chest and a Veiled Gem in the wand. And that is more DPS than what they have here with the Bindings of Dark Essence, which are the hit bracers. And they put Rod of Imprisoned Souls, but you could have Petrified Ivy Sprig here and it would be the same DPS. So you can go either wand. And the main thing in here is they're just trying to split up the bracers between the different classes. So someone needs to go hit bracers and someone needs to go non-hit bracers just to split up that loot. And so even though Armbands of the Ashen Saint actually are about 35 more DPS for Fire TTW, that's why they decided, well, they're going to take the hit bracers and the Affliction Locks will get the Armbands of the Ashen Saint. Now, I talked to Pummel about this and I asked him what's the DPS difference if this was, you know, switched around. So if the Fire TTW got the Armbands of the Ashen Saint and the Affliction Warlocks got the Bindings of Dark Essence instead, and it's about the same for them. It'd be a 35 DPS loss if they were the ones taking the hit bracers and we were taking the non-hit bracers. I mean, guys, it's a small thing. I would just, whatever your guild wants to do for Loot Prio, since it's that close, I'd say this could be either class could get either one. But it also just shows that Bindings of Dark Essence are really good. Armbands of the Ashen Saint, since it's Spirit, even though you're going over hit cap by going Bindings of Dark Essence with this loot list, if you're using the Petrified Ivy Sprig, that means you're set up well for tier 10 and starting to get that loot. You're a little over hit cap, so you have a little extra hit budget, and it's only for a little bit of a DPS loss. So if you get the hit bracers, you know, and you got a little bit less than full BIS, I wouldn't be sad about it. And so I'm just overall trying to explain why they went this way, and that's basically it. It's not real BIS, but this is just the Loot Prio sheet. and there's reasons for doing the loop prio, and that's basically the reason, what I understand. Next, I just want to touch on gemming real quick and how that's changing with Phase 3 BIS. So with Phase 2 BIS, as you can see here, there was a lot of times we were using red gems and yellow sockets and not necessarily following with the socket bonuses and just doing pure red gems. Sometimes in like this case with the Pharos gloves, you could go pure red gems, or you could have gone the purple and the orange and it would have been about the same DPS. But with Phase 3 BIS, we're actually pretty much always going with the color of the socket. And the reason for that is that mainly one is that the socket bonuses are just really good. They're pretty much always spell power for the most part, or if they're not spell power, like in the case of the gloves, it's a red gem anyways, so it's great. So we're pretty much just always following the socket colors. So like with this Bracers MB, it's 5 spell power, and we're doing the Purified Dreadstone, the 12 spell power, and the 10 spirit. And then the other reason for that is, yeah, that we have epic gems now, and the epic gems are less of a hit when you do the multicolor gem versus the pure red. So before it was plus 19 spell power, and you were basically taking a hit on a spell power by going to the multicolor, because then you'd get 9 spell power and then 8 of the other stat being crit or haste or hit. And so you were basically trading 10 spell power for 8 of that lower stat. Well, now the highest red gem is 23 spell power, and the multicolor gems have 12 spell power. So now you're only trading 11 spell power, and you're getting 10 of a stat. So it's less of a trade, basically, is what I'm trying to say. It's not as much of a hit, and then the socket bonuses are really good. So for the most part now with Phase 3 BIS, you're pretty much always following the multicolor gem. And then as usual, you're doing either, you can do 12 spell power and haste, you can do the Reckless or the Potent. You can go 12 spell power, 10 crit. It's basically up to you. They're pretty much the same. And then for the purple, you're going to go 12 spell power, 10 spirit, of course. Red, 23 spell power. And when you need to, do the Veiled, which is 12 spell power and 10 hit. That's always better than doing the 20 hit. So just toss the 12, as many Veiled as you need to get hit cap if you don't have the hit gear. And that's basically how you're going to be doing gemming with Phase 3. And if you didn't know how to get epic gems in Phase 3, you just get them from the Emblem of Heroism vendor for Emblems of Heroism. And then you can convert emblems down to Emblems of Heroism down in the sewer with this NPC here. And you can just do many at a time if you want. And so, considering people have been running Ulduar for many weeks now, there should be a plethora of epic gems, and you should be able to afford your own as well, just using your own emblems if you've been raiding all Phase 2. And so don't worry about them being expensive. And then for new items that can be crafted in Phase 3, there are 4 new items, and you can see them, they're all here. They're tailoring, and they use the Crusader Orb, which will be dropping in the new instance. It shows 8, but that's just because one's a Horde version and one's Alliance version. And it's for the Bracers and chest slots. However, the bottom 4, as you can see, they use Moonshroud, and they are, of course, Spirit chest and Spirit Bracers, so we don't care about those. We care about the Merlin's Robe and the Bejeweled Wizard's Bracers, which are both spell power, haste, crit, so non-hit bracers and non-hit chest, and very well itemized. As you can see here, it's got 3 gem sockets, eye level 245, and no spirit, just pure DPS, and same with the bracers. And so they're really good pieces, and just to demonstrate how good of pieces they are, you can see here with the bracers, you know, I'm simming them against Grasp of Reason, the eye level 252 from that dropped from XT, which were Phase 2 BIS, and they're really close in DPS. They're only 15 DPS behind the Bejeweled Wizard's Bracers, and they're far ahead of the Bindings of Dark Essence if you don't need the hit from the Bindings of Dark Essence, and obviously way ahead of the Shackles of Valhalla, which was the next best behind Grasp of Reason in Phase 2. So definitely craft these as soon as you can. They're going to be a great piece for you until you get Armbands of the Ashen Saint, if you ever do. And even if you don't get Armbands of the Ashen Saint until you say you're using these until the end, they're not even that far behind Armbands of the Ashen Saint, as you can see here. Just about 45 DPS. So these are really good. Craft them right away. And then the chest, well, there's a number of different chest pieces now with Tier 9, and you can get the, if you need hit, you can get the 245 tier chest, of course. If you don't need hit, Merlin's Robe are really great, and they're just an easy upgrade straight from the 232 Tier 8 piece. There was no other good chest off piece in Tier 8, and so now we have this craftable that we can right away go to if you don't need the hit, and if you need an off piece for your chest slot. So also a really good piece if you can make use of it, but this one's obviously a little harder to make use because it's a tier slot, and we're likely going to be using it this tier slot for hit. But the wrist, definitely craft it as soon as you can if you don't already have Grasp of Reason. Next, I want to cover the emblem vendor, so the items that you can purchase using your Emblems of Triumph. The TLDR here is that none of these items are really worth it. I would just be using your emblems on tier. For instance, the Brimstone Igniter wand looks pretty decent, but then you realize you get the Petrified Ivy Sprig just from running dungeons through the Sidereal Essence, and the Petrified Ivy Sprig is just simply superior. Likewise for the ring, the Band of the Invoker. At first glance, it's like, oh, this is item level 245. This is pretty good. But then you can get the Nebula Band from Sidereal Essence once again, which sims about 40 DPS more than this. It's just a much better ring. It's got the gem slot, while this one doesn't. And so I just wouldn't waste your emblems on this unless you have plenty to spare and you already have a Nebula Band and need another ring for the slot. So I'd just be catch-up gear. And the same basically goes for the helm and the shoulders that you can buy. Only if you had a plethora of emblems and you didn't have tier tokens to buy for this. But again, it's just a very niche thing. I wouldn't use your emblems on it. You're going to be getting tier for those slots once you have a trophy. Don't be wasting your emblems on this. And then lastly, we have the Talisman of Resurgence, which looks like it could be decent for Arcane, which it is okay for Arcane, but it's only if you need catch-up gear, because otherwise, you know, Flare, Rain, Scale, and Pandora's Plea are all better non-hit trinket options. So again, wouldn't be using the trinket unless you're Arcane and you really need that catch-up gear and you have a plethora of emblems. And so that's just the general gist here is I wouldn't be worrying about any of these. I would just be using your emblems on tier, and then also Crusader's Orb for gold, and you can just get the Sidereal Essence for better gear by running Heroic ++s. For 10-man items, unlike Phase 2, there's nothing that is going to be BIS for the phase. However, there's a number of item level 245 upgrades throughout 10-man Heroic. As long as you're doing Heroic, then you're going to get these 245 upgrades dropping left and right, and you can take advantage of them if you don't already have something that's item level 245 or higher from Phase 2. So for instance, for one-handers, there is both a hit and a non-hit one-hander, the non-hit one-hander being from faction champions, and then the hit one-hander being from the tribute chest, as you can see here. And there's both two non-hit staves as well, one being from a Nubarak right here, the Cold Convergence, and the other being Enlightenment that drops off Velx. Some other good 10-man heroic items to be looking out for as upgrades is, of course, offhand wise, you know, there was nothing that was higher than 232 throughout Phase 2 other than Cosmos, so it was relatively rare for people to have this. So there's a lot of people running around with a Star Shard Edge and just a 232 offhand. Well, now there is a 245 offhand that drops from Velx. 10-man heroic, the Chalice of Benedictus. It's got a gem slot as well, so really good if you can get this. If you don't already have Cosmos and you're running a one-hand and an offhand, so that's something to keep an eye out for. As well as if you need a hit neck, you haven't already gotten the Pendant of Fiery Havoc in Phase 2. There's a 245 hit neck, the Darkbane Pendant that drops off of Velx. So that's another item to be looking up for. There's also, if you don't have Petrified Ivy Sprig, you can obviously just farm that from the heroic dungeons now, which is what I recommend. But you could, until you do that, there's Rod of Imprisoned Souls, which drops off Ice Howl, which is pretty good as a non-hit wand. But again, Petrified Ivy Sprig is just goated, so I would just farm this and get that. There's also a belt that drops off of Ice Howl, the Ice Howl Cinch, which is a hit belt. So say you're using the crafted belt, Sash of Ancient Power, then the Ice Howl Cinch will be a nice hit-to-hit item upgrade. Then ring-wise, if you need hit and you can do it from your ring slot, then the Firestorm ring, which drops off Jaraxxus, is really well itemized, spell, hit, and crit, and it's got a red socket. So this is a really good ring if you can utilize hit in the ring socket and you don't have better rings. Again, all item level 245. And then for boots, there is both hit and non-hit boots that drop from 10-man, item level 245, of course. From Action Champions with Silver Magus for Alliance, whatever it is, all for Horde, or spell, hit, and crit. And then from Velx, there is the Boots of the Grieving Soul, which are non-hit boots. They're Spirit, so that's unfortunate. But if you have 232 boots, going to these, I'm pretty sure is going to be an upgrade just from the 13 item levels, even though it's Spirit. So you got those options as well for an upgrade. And then, of course, last but not least, there is the cloak that you could get from 10-man, which is going to be an item level 258 cloak. This one, the Drape of Bitter Incantation for Alliance at least, which is second best only to the very coveted 272 cloak from 25-man Heroic, which is going to be, you have to have all 50 attempts remaining, and having all 50 attempts remaining on 10-man Heroic is way easier than 25-man. 10-man's a joke from what I hear. It's pretty easy to full clear, so like, you know, just a few weeks into it, you should be able to have your group doing 50 attempts remaining as long as they're pretty competent and decently geared. And then you could be getting these cloaks, and this is second best until you can get that 272 cloak. So really good cloak drop. Definitely be running 10-man to get this as an upgrade until you can get that 272 cloak. And the last thing I want to touch on before I go into each of the different spec sets is that there's a number of different alternate gearing paths, like I had mentioned before, that are going to be the same DPS or very close to the full BIS sets that I mentioned. So As you can tell with the Wowhead one, it may differ in some ways for both Arcane as well as the fire sets that he has, the fire and the FFB from my set. For instance, his Frostfire Alliance set does the Court of Biting Cold and the Flowing Vestments and whatnot. And then my set uses the Skyweaver Robes, which is the hit chest off piece, and then the Court of the Tenebrous Mist, which is the non-hit belt for Alliance. So basically the Wowhead list swaps those around in terms of using a hit belt and the non-hit chest, and they're both very close to DPS. Mine seems a little higher in DPS, I think, like 15 to 20 DPS higher, but it's still very close. And you know, there's just different advantages to going with each of these things. You know, the Skyweaver robe is going to be more contested, and so by going the non-hit one, it's less contested. You have a better chance of getting that, and it's still very close in DPS. And so, you know, these BIS lists that I have listed here are just basically the most optimal combination between hit pieces and non-hit pieces for eye level 258 pieces to get the most amount of bang for your buck. But you need to take into account how contested the loot is, what is going to be possible for your guild given how you're doing prio on items, and the combination that's going to work best for you, because this is going to be a shorter phase, right? This is probably not going to be much more than 12 to 14 weeks for this phase, because they already said it was going to be shorter phase than Ulduar, certainly, and just a shorter phase in general. So there's going to be less time to get all this loot, and so you have to be realistic and realize you're probably not going to be able to get full BIS. And so don't be worried about doing this exact BIS list. Just be worried about hitting close to hit cap with a different combination of the hit and non-hit pieces that are possible. So for each of the different slots, there's essentially a hit and a non-hit piece, right? And so you could do a number of different combinations. The only difference with that is the neck. Okay, the neck is there's just this one neck, and that's basically what it is when it comes to item level 258. You just have the Wail of the Valkyr non-hit neck. And on the note of the neck, this actually brings me to my next alternate gearing path that you could consider. Instead of going the non-hit neck with the Valkyrie neck, which is going to be very contested, as you can tell from the loot prio sheet, pretty much everyone needs that neck for their full BIS, of course, because there is no other 258 neck. Something that you could do instead is you could just look at going for using the Flame Leviathan neck throughout the phase. So you go the FL neck with hit, you go the non-hit robes for your chest option, and then you go the Bindings of Dark Essence for your bracers, the hit bracers, and you also then are no longer using, or you're using one veiled in your wand, but then that's how you can hit your spell hit cap, and this is going to be about 75 DPS less than full BIS. So you're taking that hit, but at the same time, you then don't need to get that super contested neck slot, and you also are getting a less contested chest piece, again, depending on how your guild is doing loot prio in terms of the chest pieces for the off piece. So that's something to consider. There's those kind of alternate gearing paths that you can go. Another just quick example of an alternate gearing path would be to use Pharaoh's Gloves as your off piece instead of the 258 hit chest piece. So if you already have Pharaoh's Gloves, then that takes care of your off piece. So that's one less piece you need, and you could just get 258 tier chest from that token. So granted, you're gonna have to be using a tier token in order to get that, but the Skyweaver robes and the 258 tier 9 both have the exact same amount of hit. And so if you take a look here, if I just swap out the off piece for the tier piece for the chest, and then go to hands and put on the Pharaoh's Gloves, run, you can see we're only looking at about a 48 DPS decrease, and now you don't even need to worry about your off piece if you already have the Pharaoh's Gloves. Especially if you're running splits and you know that you're gonna for sure get the enough 258 tokens, or you're getting prioed them because mages are just the best, then it's just a really good option, and you don't have to worry about getting that chest piece, which might be, even with splits, could be hard to get. So that's just something to consider as well. And just in general, what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a number of different alternate gearing paths. The main thing is that, doing the 258 pieces that are going to get you close to BIS, but maybe not full BIS, right? Maybe not the full optimal combination. Maybe you have to go with Bindings of Dark Essence instead of the Armbands of the Ashen Saint, or maybe you have to go with hit boots instead of the non-hit boot, and then you're going non-hit belt instead of the hit belt. You're swapping those hit pieces around. That's going to be a little bit less than full BIS, but it's still going to be pretty close. And that's why you're going to notice a number of differences between the Fusion Loot Prio Sheet, the Wowhead list, the Icy Veins list, and my list, is because there's actually a number of different ways to go about this, and they're all very close in DPS. That's just something to keep in mind here, is do what's going to be best for your loot situation with your guild, how they're doing loot prio, as well as your gear and what's going to be most upgrade for you, and don't be hard focused on doing what this specific BIS list is. There's a number of different alternate gearing paths that you could go. Before I get into BIS gearing for each of the different sets, I want to cover that I do have staff setups. I'm not going to cover them individually because it's too much to cover and it's not necessarily important. I mean, the main thing with BIS setups is you get to see the list yourself. And so I have the staff BIS setups in the video description for you to look at. And I also have the, in parentheses, the minus amount refers to how much of a DPS loss it is compared to full BIS setup, because the full BIS setups, of course, all use one-handers and an offhand. So you could tell that it's different for which faction, as well as which spec will take more of a hit or less of a hit. And I haven't rerun these numbers, so there might have been some sim changes in the future that are going to change these, and these are just approximate values. Just know you're going to be losing probably somewhere between 150 to 200 DPS versus full BIS, but then you only have one item to get it as opposed to two, so that's the advantage with having to go staff, right? And it's also going to be a lot less contested loot and a lot easier to get that staff, so versus getting the one hand and an offhand, right? So just things to take into consideration, and if you want to go the staff route, those sets are there in the video description. All right, so here's Fire TTW BIS as well as Fire TTW BIS Horde. The main difference between Horde and Alliance is that the Horde is going to be getting Dark Essence bindings, while for Alliance, it's just armbands with the Ashen Saint. As I covered before, there's differences in BIS lists, like the Fusion Loot Prio sheet done by Jordy and Pummel. They have bindings of Dark Essence. This is 35 DPS less than actual BIS, but they're just trying to separate out the armbands of the Ashen Saint and the bindings of Dark Essence between the classes that could utilize those. You could swap these. Bindings of Dark Essence unlocks is about a 35 DPS hit as well, and then Mage is getting armbands of the Ashen Saint. So really either class could get those, either one. I think it just needs to be talked over inside your guild, and so that's just something to keep in mind. Some other data points that are important to consider as far as DPS amounts. The Cloak is about 150 DPS upgrade, so very significant. Rain is, however, our highest prio. That's going to be even more DPS than that. It's about maybe something like 170, 180 DPS upgrade. But however, that's in full Phase 3 BIS. Rain, the Unlimited, starts out at something like maybe 115 DPS increase from Phase 2 BIS. So if you're already in Phase 2 BIS, the Cloak actually starts out as a bigger upgrade, but by the end of the phase, it's more than that. However, I wouldn't utilize that for just making decisions or anything. I would put this as higher prio for sure. It's more DPS in the end. It's very rare. We hardly saw any of these on the PTR, even though we cleared the instance many times. So definitely, if you can get this, it's huge. Banded Deplorable Violence. This is the non-hit ring, I should say, because the for the Horde, it's the Lurid Manifestation. Right, there's different names, the Horde and Alliance, but that ring, going from Nebula Band to that, is about a 90 DPS increase, so pretty significant. That's another good piece to get. And then all the tier gear is what I would put as my next prio, because going from eye level 245 to 258 for all the tier pieces is something around 80 to 100 DPS. Granted, these are all ballpark numbers because your situation could be different and things change, but they're about that much. So just straight up being able to increase the eye level of your gear is 80 to 100 DPS per piece, roughly. So also another thing to consider. Also the Valknecht, there is no other non-hit Valknecht option, because there's obviously the normal one, but you can't clear normal and heroic. And so if your guild is clearing heroic on everything, then next best option is the Ulduar necks, right? And going from those necks to the Wail of the Valkyr is something like a 120, 130 DPS increase, so pretty significant. So that's another thing to maybe put as a desirable loot item if you don't have like the Flame Leviathan neck and using that for hit. But it is also very loot contested, so that might go against you as far as loot prio, might count as a big item going to, just something to keep in mind. So if you already have something like the Flame Leviathan neck and you're using that for hit, then the Wail of Valkyr is maybe something you want to put lower on prio. Another thing to consider, like I had mentioned before, is you could just look at going for using the Flame Leviathan neck throughout the phase. So you go the FL neck with hit, you go the non-hit robes for your chest option, and then you go the Bindings of Dark Essence for your bracers, the hit bracers, and you also then are no longer using, you're using one veiled in your wand, and that's how you can hit your spell hit cap, and this is going to be about 75 DPS less than full BIS, so you're taking that hit, but at the same time you then don't need to get that super contested neck slot, and you also are getting less contested chest piece, again depending on how your guild is doing loot prio in terms of the chest pieces for the off piece. So that's something to consider. There's those kind of alternate gearing paths that you can go. So you could just look at going for using the Flame Leviathan neck throughout the phase. So you go the FL neck with hit, you go the non-hit robes for your chest option, and then you go the Bindings of Dark Essence for your bracers, the hit bracers, and you also then are no longer using, you're using one veiled in your wand, and that's how you can hit your spell hit cap, and this is going to be about, you know, 75 DPS less than full bis, so you're taking that hit, but at the same time, you then don't need to get that super contested neck slot, and you also are getting a less contested chest piece, again, depending on how your guild is doing loot prio in terms of the chest pieces for the off piece. So that's something to consider. There's those, you know, kind of alternate gearing paths that you can go. And on that note, another alternate gearing path you can go is the hit one-hander versus the non-hit one-hander. So by going the hit one-hander, Blade of Tarask for Alliance, and then for Horde, it is Barb of Tarask. If you go that with the then non-hit offhand, so the spell power crit spirit offhand, which is Mystifying Charm for Horde and Chalice of Syrian Light for Alliance, that's about 25 DPS less than full bis, but that Blade of Tarask, that hit one-hander, fair chance it could be less contested depending on how your guild is doing loot, and same with the offhand, and so then that could be easier for you to obtain. So again, less than full bis, but if it's easier to obtain and more realistic, and you can actually get it by the end of the phase versus not getting anything by the end of the phase, going the other route, then I would recommend, you know, considering that. Also, it goes without saying, but if you already have 252 pieces, I would put them as lower prio for upgrades than versus 258. The 6i level increase is typically not going to be much of a DPS increase. So like, for instance, if you're going from Cosmos to the 258 hit offhand, you're only looking at about a 35 DPS increase. For bracers, you know, there's the craftable option now, so we can get the Bejeweled Wizard's bracers, which are really good, spell power crit haste, and the armbands of the Ashen Saint, the non-hit bracers, are only like a 35 DPS increase over those. So basically, I would just, obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but I would put those as lower prio. There is no other option as far as chest off piece, so that's something to consider putting as higher prio. But again, as I talked about before in the alternate gearing paths section, if you have Pharaoh's Gloves are a really good off piece, and you could just consider using those as an off piece till the end of the phase, really, and just putting the Skyweaver robes as lower prio, just because there's such a really good item. So going from Pharaoh's Gloves to eye level 245 gloves and the Skyweaver robes is only about an 80 DPS increase. So you have to get these, and then you go to eye level 245, and it's still only that much of an increase. Now, if you can also, if you are running splits and you have a plethora of 258 tokens going around in your guild, and you're going to be able to get 258 Khadgar's Gauntlets of Triumph, and then for Horde, it's the Sunstrider's Gauntlets of Triumph. If you're able to get that 258 piece with the Skyweaver robes, going from Pharaoh's to those two pieces is going to be about 150 DPS increase. It is pretty significant, but to put into context, if you did a sim of just the Pharaoh's gloves versus the 258 gloves, and actually for this comparison, I need to change the chest to the tier chest, level 258, which has the exact same amount of hit as the hit 258 off piece, and that way we're not breaking the tier bonus when we do this comparison. And if you just do a straight one-to-one comparison, they're both non-hit gloves, so you can do this. You're looking at the Pharaoh's Gloves actually being almost 40 DPS more, because the Pharaoh's Gloves are just that good. Even though they're the 6i levels lower, they got that extra gem slot, and that really makes the difference with epic gems. So Pharaoh's Gloves, really good. And again, you'd only be going to the 258 hit piece once you have that, and also like a token at least for 245 gloves. And yes, that's a DPS increase going up to that, just because your chest off piece is not going to be any higher than 245, right? Because there's no 252 off pieces from Ulduar, but still it's only going to be about a 75 DPS increase, so it's something you maybe want to consider putting as lower prio if you have Pharaoh's Gloves, and just using Pharaoh's Gloves as long as you can, just because it's not as big of an increase. Now, if you're running splits and you have the tokens to also be upgrading your gloves, the tier gloves, to 258 at the same time as you do that, then yeah, it's like a 150, 160 DPS increase, but still something to be considering. And then lastly, I don't think I mentioned it, but this setup does use hit gems. It's using 2 Veil gems, 1 in the Skyweaver robes. You can put them wherever you want, but 1 in the Petrified Ivy Sprig, 1 in the Skyweaver robes. And then for Horde, since it's using the Dark Essence bindings, it's just using 1 Veil gem in the Petrified Ivy Sprig. You can put it wherever though, of course. And so that's just something to note with the gems. Lastly, if you do decide to go staff, just know that, you know, this is what it is for Alliance, and you're going to be going to the hit bracers with a few veiled gems in order to make up the hit from the loss of the offhand. So if you go the staff option, you're just going to be using the hit bracers with some more veiled gems. And then for Horde, you're going to be going the Boots of the Icy Flow, which are your hit boots, and then you don't need to be using the veiled gems. You can just be using Reckless or Potent, and that makes up for the hit that you're not getting from the offhand slot if you decide to go a staff route. And again, the parenthesis here, this just means DPS loss from going the staff route versus a full BIS setup, as I talked about in the staff section. So these are just approximate values just to give you an idea if you decide to go the staff route. But again, if it's more realistic and obtainable for you, then that's the way to go, because it's better to get a weapon upgrade than to not get a weapon upgrade at all, right? So even though it's not full BIS and it's less than full BIS is a lot of times unrealistic to get by the end of a phase. For FFB, if you've continued to play FFB, you know, you do you, but I do recommend going Fire TTW, as it's just going to outscale FFB in Fire TTW BIS gearing, but I'm still going to cover it just to cover it, I guess. For my setup, I have Skyweaver robes still being used, so as you can see, this is still similar to the Fire TTW build, with the exception that we're doing the non-hit belt versus the hit belt. So the Fire TTW is using the Biting Cold, of course, and this one is not, as well as no hit gems at all. And I actually have the same for both Horde and BIS as far as the item setup here. So it's the exact same for mine. Now, if you compare this to the Wowhead list, Philippe has them using the non-hit chest instead of the hit chest, and then using the Biting Cold hit belt for Alliance, and then for Horde, the Dark Essence biting the hit bracers in combination with the Biting Cold for that extra hit for Horde. And then I believe he has a Veiled Gem in the in one of the slots, yeah, in the Alliance setup with the non-hit bracers, non-hit chest, and the hit belt. I was getting, you know, a little bit more DPS with my setup, just something like 20, you know, so not a big increase with going the Skyweaver robes, which is also more contested. So just note that, again, this just speaks to the different alternate gearing paths you can go. They're all very close in DPS in terms of swapping different items around for the most part. In this case, it kind of did surprise me that Skyweaver robes, not using them when you have the opportunity to use them, could still be so close going that other alternate gearing path. Like I had mentioned before, though, this 258 hit chest piece is really good in terms of utilizing hit. It's just got the 3 gem slots, a lot of other good things. And so if you can use this for hit, it is like your biggest bang for your buck, and so it did some a little higher DPS, but it's still very similar to DPS in terms of using the non-hit chest. So if this setup is going to be more realistic for you to obtain, then I recommend going this setup, right? They're very close in DPS, and you could go either one, really. That said, again, I do highly recommend everyone that's considering still being FFB throughout Phase 3, I recommend making that switch once you get the hit gear, because Fire TTW just will outscale it. It's just the way it is, and so I think you're going to be better off going Fire TTW than FFB. And especially because Ignite Munching is fixed with Phase 3, right? So there's really no added benefit other than playstyle, right? FFB, the main reason we went it again in Phase 2 was just for speedrunning, because it was more mana efficient than at Fire TTW, and because it had better AoE with Blizzard. And, you know, that's just not really needed in TOGC at all. And maybe there's going to still be speedrunning in Ulduar in Phase 3, and then we'll use FFB, but that doesn't mean you'd change your entire gearing around that. You'd still go for Fire TTW BIS, and then just swap to FFB and take a little bit of a hit and gain the extra DPS from being more mana efficient in AoE. So again, you know, you do you, and this is the setup for it, but I do recommend going Fire TTW. And then of course there's the staff setups. If you do decide to go staff, you're basically just going to be using the hit belt then if you decide to go staff as FFP. And similarly for Horde, you'll be going the hit belt, the Biting Cold, to make up for the hit loss from the offhand, and then yeah, using the staff, and then everything else basically stays the same. And now for you Arcane Mages, the few of you that still remain doing the Lord's work and providing us that 3% damage buff in the raid when there isn't a Ret Pally or BM Hunter, or maybe you just really like Arcane, whatever may be the case. This is BIS setup for you guys, and as you can see, we're using a lot of non-hit BIS items because obviously Arcane just doesn't require that much, especially as Alliance. We only need 7%, and so we're using the non-hit chest. We are still using Petrified Ivy Sprig as a hit item, and we're also using the Chalice of the Benedictus, which is important to note because this is actually the from Heroic 10-man, okay? Because the 258 ones are all like crit and spirit based, or they have crit, and crit is just not as good for Arcane as haste is. So the 245 eye level one from 10-man Heroic is actually BIS for Arcane versus the other one. So that's nice, because that's basically should be like free loot. No one else should be caring about that much when you say that this is BIS for me. You know, you'd think they'd pass on it in the 10-man then, and so then you should be able to get that piece at least, which is pretty nice. However, that said, for Alliance, we are using some hit gems. We're using a Veiled in the chest and then a Veiled in the Petrified Ivy Sprig. Obviously, you can put them in any yellow slots, but just something to keep in mind. That gets us a 7%, and this is what I got as the best BIS setup for Alliance. Note that Philippe did get a little bit different. He's going the hit weapon, along with, again, the 245 eye level offhand, and so he's using that for the hit instead of the hit gems. And he is using the Rod of Imprisoned Souls from 10 man as well instead of the Petrified Ivy Sprig. And it's funny that this setup actually sims the exact same as this setup. So you could go either one that you want. Both the wands should be relatively free, but the Petrified Ivy Sprig is a guaranteed, right, just from farming the dungeons. That's what I like about that. However, maybe the hit weapon is going to be easier for you to obtain than the non-hit weapon, right? So depending on your situation, you should go whichever one is more easier to obtain because they're both the exact same. Now for Horde, the difference is I got the same as Philippe, which is that you're going to want to go the hit weapon with the Petrified Ivy Sprig and everything else being non-hit as well. And then as Horde, if you did want to go the non-hit weapon, you could go the non-hit weapon and then just gem a bunch of Veiled. You don't want to use any of the other hit options for any of the other slots because they are all crit and hit for the most part. And so you want to continue to use Haste as Arcane. Haste is way more valuable than crit. Crit is not that great for Arcane. And so you want to continue using the Ashen Saint, Mourning Widow, Tenebrous Mist, all these Haste 258 pieces. And again, that's why we're using the 245 offhand, because the other 258 ones are crit and Haste is just that much better. And so you then, to make up the not having the hit on your one-hander, if you go the non-hit one-hander as Horde, you're just going to do a lot of Veiled gems. And that's how you're going to make up that. So you're just use a lot of Veiled gems in any of these yellow slots. You're going to use 5 of them, and that'll make up for the not having the 50 hit from this one-hander. That's going to be about 30 DPS less, but it does give you an alternate gearing path if for whatever reason you don't want to go the hit one-hander as Horde. But again, as Alliance, if you do that, it's going to be the exact same DPS as whether you go the hit one-hander as Alliance, the Blade of Tarask, versus going Blade of the Unbroken Covenant. You can go either route as I talked about before, and they're the same DPS. Well guys, that concludes the Phase 3 BIS gearing guide. 51 minutes and counting once again. I apologize, but I wanted to be thorough and get everything in there, so I do hope it helped. If you enjoyed it and you appreciate it, then please drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Crypteria. Obviously like and subscribe to YouTube, share it, and also join the Discord. All this stuff helps grow the channel, and as well as the Twitch stream, and I really appreciate all you guys doing that. Good luck in TOGC, and if you're able to make it out for the TOGC launch race next Thursday, I'd appreciate any of the support. I'll be streaming it. It'll be a quick race, but it definitely will be a fun one, so I hope to see you there. Anyways, take care, have a good weekend, and a good launch with TOGC, and I hope you enjoy Phase 3. Cheers.